for joining us. And now I'm going to open up my chat.
Yeah, I just opened up the chat box.
Great.
Someone made a wonderful comment about it's no different for 5-year-olds and 50-year-old bodies, and I think that's that's absolutely true. This is a lifetime journey, and it can't start too soon, and it can't end too early. So a great thought.
J.A. asked in the chat about the Navy case and put in a link there, sicsec.org/Navy. And that's a really interesting case. We worked with the Navy and Marine Corps and Coast Guard chaplains for 18 months on supporting them to develop the skills to be better change makers. Okay, so Yoshi. But not where this whole process originates, the ground level up employees. And I think, it's true that in some ways we can talk about value in a dollars and cents way, but we can also talk about value in a human way. Do people want to come to work? Do they feel motivated and inspired by what they're doing? Do they go home and say, oh God, it was another day of work today? Or do they go home and say, I really contributed something meaningful today? And I think that experience, it's the same thing with children in school, by the way. That experience, if you're looking forward to going to work tomorrow, there's a value that's created, that's a human value. And what we're seeing is that human value can translate, it can be measured and translate into economic value.
And Beth and a number of other people talked about and I think that so many of these cases illustrate the point that we can get real hard-nosed data on the soft people side of things, including emotions, including their EQ competencies. And with those actionable data, we're able to produce meaningful change. And I think that's the key. We can't change, we can't measure, and so many people in so many organizations don't have access to the kind of people-centric information that allows them to make intelligent decisions.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of organizations, they're surveying employees every 2 years, and their employee survey is about things like, do you like the snacks in the cafeteria? Kind of missing the emotional experience. And so it's really hard to manage with that kind of data. So Yoshi asked about that, how do we measure it? Well, I mean, of course, at 6 Seconds, we publish tools for this. And the organizational vital signs tool in the Komatsu case that Paul mentioned, that was using the organizational vital signs tool or the team vital signs tool.
Team, yeah.
We can measure it for individual leaders, we can measure it for teams, we can measure it for whole organizations. And these factors that were in that Komatsu case, with trust at the center, we can measure it at all those levels. And it's called vital signs because, when you go into the hospital, you don't, they don't do a, MRI right away, usually. They get the initial data, they check your vital signs. And that's the idea here. It's not that this tells you everything there is to know in this 7 million page report and this big fat binder that we have to pour through. It's this very quick pulse check of what's happening in the emotional dynamics of the organization, and that is something you can manage too, because you can do it often. It's low cost, it's quick, and you can do it often and get what's happening here.
We didn't use the word today, but I think the other thing that focusing on EQ does is allow us to produce sustainability in the organization, sustainable performance. You can even have good data and not mobilize it, not provide the feedback that it is screaming at you to do. This is an ongoing process. And focusing on the people side makes that much easier in terms of continuing these relationships and really leading to sustainable performance, both at the people and the financial level.
Eric Steinbach asked, I'm interested in key EQ competencies for entry-level managers and college interns. Are they the same ones as the more seasoned leaders? And actually, I can't give you a complete answer on that. I can say, no, they're not the same. If you look at the State of the Heart report, sicsec.org/SOH, State of the Heart, you'll see some data there about career progression. Oh, and we have the career progression chart in the business case as well. And what we could see there is that the differentiator to go from employee to new manager was slightly different than the differentiators to go from managers to senior executives. We don't have that analysis for college students, but we actually have the data for college students.
Yeah.
So we could do that analysis as well, and to see, which are the key competencies for each step of this journey.
And interestingly, there's a continued increase in overall EQ as you climb the career ladder.
Yeah, which makes sense because EQ is correlated a larger scope of leadership, that they're developing more EQ and they're required to have more EQ. Unfortunately, they don't all have it, but on average they do.
I don't know if you want to mention the profiles, Josh, as a different way to look at maybe younger groups, millennials, others who might be responsive to that kind of concept.
Yeah, the profiles are really lovely tools that are super visual, super engaging way to start this conversation and looking at talents that differentiate leadership today. And if you go to 6seconds.org/brain, you can read more about the profiles and how those work. Kelly Schulte asked a question which I want to make sure we touch on. Do you have best demonstrated practices on how to implement EQ training and coaching in an organization? And we actually have an ebook. If you go to 6seconds.org/business, you'll see the link to the ebook. And it's another ebook that's about, it's kind of a brochure ebook that's about methodologies that we're seeing people using effectively in learning and development. So it's an ebook for learning and development and emotional intelligence. And it talks about some of the approaches that are being used. From my perspective, I love the Komatsu example, which is it wasn't a training, it was a project. More and more to that kind of methodology and getting rid of training in the classroom and saying, okay, let's do something in the organization. Let's do an experiment. Let's improve X. Let's deliver Y. And let's have these 3 teams and let's try something different in these 3 teams and make it a little competition. And training, but the training is kind of provided not based on what we as trainers or an HR department thinks is important. It's training based on the team is working on X and they say, wait a minute, we need to know more about this. And so it's kind of led by the real world needs.
And I think the other interesting thing now that Josh has expanded on that particular case is that the 3 so-called vital teams that they created focused on not your traditional things. They focused on imagination, exploration, and celebration. So they were definitely outside the norm in terms of being creative about that process. And one of the things we say at 6 Seconds is that the process is, in fact, the content. And I think that's a great example of how we have to sort of embed what we want into the very processes that we use to work with people.
Megan asked about trust. and the challenge of trust. And when you don't feel trust, how do you actually start? One of the things that I realized in my relationships, and we talk about it in a lot of our trainings, is that trust is reciprocal. And if I am feeling distrust towards my teenage son, for example, I can almost guarantee he's feeling distrust towards me. And I think this is a really interesting realization, that if you consider that trust is always reciprocal, it's about a dynamic between people or between people and systems. One of the questions that I would ask you to consider, Megan, and I know this is a tough way to approach this, but I would like you to consider, what can you do to be more trustworthy in those relationships? And what can you do to demonstrate your own trustworthiness, and then to give your coworkers and employees opportunities to demonstrate their trustworthiness? And I know that's not an easy way to do it, but I think it works.
Great. Any other questions that people would like to pose?
Eric, thank you for using the say in emotional intelligence in your college class. And I think that's a great point, that we can see in the State of the Heart report, for example, that the overall level of EQ is increasing as people become more senior in organizations. And so as new leaders, there's where maybe we shouldn't have an expectation that we're like, yeah, masters of EQ, but recognizing that they're learnable skills. And I think emphasizing the fact that these are learnable skills. And if you want to develop, if you see the value in this, that's the key thing. You see that this is something worthwhile for your leadership, part of your picture of what it means to be a leader. And then you can start working on it.
And I think that comment and the comment that Petra just added really identifies an emerging trend that we're seeing, is the use of EQ in higher education in many different ways, using it in research, using it to build cohorts of incoming students, to improve relationships. People are now taking EQ assessments when they come into a college or a graduate program. And I predict that our next edition of the business case will have some really powerful examples from academia about how this can really change the environment and the landscape there.
And by the way, in case you didn't know, 6 Seconds provides grants for research that's being formally done at a university level or inside a company or in a school, but also for informal research. As a leader, maybe you want to do a research project with your own team. There are a couple of questions about other methodologies, other tools, Enneagram, NLP, other approaches, and I don't feel qualified to comment on that, other than to say, I think that there's a lot of work that's done in the world around people and how we understand ourselves and how we work together, and there's a lot of value in that. The value of emotional intelligence, I think, is specific to this intersection of emotions and intelligence. The idea that emotions are valuable data, there's meaning in emotions, we can understand our brains process emotions in very specific ways. They have physiological effects. And so when I'm focused on emotional intelligence, I really want to focus on that unique intersection where we're using emotions as a source of meaningful information and decoding that information and using that emotional data as something valuable to help us make decisions, because that's the meaning of intelligence. Accurately acquiring and effectively using data to solve problems. Great.
Wonderful.
Well, Paul, that was fun, and thank you everybody
for joining. Yeah, it was great.
I
Thank
look
you,
forward to our
everyone.
next 20-minute webinar.
It's virtually 20 minutes.
Virtually 20 minutes. All right,
All right.
Kenny, stop recording and